technology is a really exciting place to work, right? There's always a new tool, a new framework, a new paradigm to learn. But also technology is an exhausting place to work, right? There's always a new tool, a new paradigm, a new technology to learn, right? So that's part of the hazard we have as professionals, is to keep learning new things. So when Pablo and I were talking about doing this talk, what we thought was we wanted to create something that would let someone who'd heard about data mesh kind of know what it's about, right? There's a lot of like fashions and new things that come around in technology, especially in the data space, as the people here well know. And so I imagine that some of you will have, seen people mentioning it on Twitter, or you've heard the words and you're like, data mesh, I guess that's a mesh of data, right? And not really knowing what it was, maybe felt a little bit apprehensive or guilty that there's this thing that other people are talking about that you haven't covered yet. So this talk is for you, if that's if that's your experience. We want to explain what it is. We want you to understand why it exists and what kind of problems it solves, so that next time someone asks you about data mesh, you can confidently reply. Now, why should you listen to us talk about it? Well, we work for the company ThoughtWorks, which is where this articulation of these concepts come from. So as we'll explain shortly, data mesh is composed of many things that you probably already know and have been developed in other contexts. It's more of a new framing of concepts for a new context, rather than something that has just emerged from nothing, right? I was a member of early conversations about it. I was a technical reviewer for the book Data Mesh by Zhamak Dehani. Zhamak Dehani is, I guess, the founder of Data Mesh, the person who coined the term, the person who did all the really hard work in describing what goes into it. So I think I'm a good person to give you some kind of historical context. And Pablo?
Yeah, I'm more like a practitioner, right? Like I've been working in a data mesh project for the last year, helping a client to implement data mesh in what can be considered one of the most mature data mesh implementations out there at the moment. So I come from more like a practical view, and hopefully we can complement each other and give you that introduction to this new paradigm.
Yeah, sounds great. Cool. So to start with an introduction, we should explain what we're going to cover in this talk, right? So there's three main sections we're going to get to. First, we're going to talk about the value proposition of data mesh. Like why should you care about it? What is it going to give you if you engage with it? Then we're going to go a bit deeper into like what it is. What is it made of? What are the parts of data mesh? What counts as data mesh and what is not data mesh? And then finally, we're going to take a dive into the practicalities. So we're going to talk about why it's important, and we're going to cover a couple of cases of data mesh implementations that Pablo and I have had contact with over the past couple of years to show what it looks like in the real world. Cool. And one thing that we should stress is that because the aim of this talk is to give you an orientation of what data mesh is, if we have to choose between clarity or the precision of including all sorts of like edge cases and special cases that might not apply and don't really contribute to the overall concept, we're going to go with clarity every time. So please repay our trust. You're professionals, you're adults. We're going to indulge in simplifications, and that's because we know that you, when you come to use concepts in the real world, you do actually do your research. You don't just use something because someone at a conference said it, right? Cool. So please repay our trust with that. So an example of
exactly
simplification.
The first simplification, right? You can think of data mesh as the following formula, right?
Yeah.
Like combination of domain-driven design plus microservices, this architecture in the operational world, multiplied by data, right? And that's how we will express data mesh. So all these paradigm, right? Domain-driven design, microservices, architectures, have helped the operational world in the last 10 years or 5 years to scale, right? A scaled organization, as the organization grow in complexity, as the business grow in complexity, optimize for fast flow, right? And basically being able to react quickly to changes. So you can think of data mesh, as Chris said, as a paradigm that tries to combine all these ideas and apply to data management, right? Of course, like any simplification, this is a sort of representation, as we will see during the presentation.
And maybe one note, if you were in Stefan's talk this morning, I think you could see a lot of the things that Stefan was talking about how to organize groups of people to achieve things together with autonomy. Basically, all the stuff you heard from Stefan applied to data is what we're going to cover. And if you've already seen his talk, it's a really good preparation for this one. Cool. So moving on to the promise, the value kind of proposition. So if you'll indulge us for a second, we want to pan out a bit and talk about different architectural paradigms, because we think that it's in the historical context that you can most easily understand what is data mesh and why is it important. So in our little schema here, we say that an architectural paradigm is a kind of a promise that something makes to you. That if you fulfill some conditions, whatever they might be, you can obtain some benefits. That's great. So long as you don't mind the costs, right? And so like it's almost all the case that any kind of paradigm or tool or approach you take is a trade-off. And so you need to decide whether you're okay to do the thing that counts as fulfilling the paradigm, whether you actually value and want the benefits, and whether you're willing to tolerate or compensate for the downsides. So that's true of any paradigm, including data mesh.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that a paradigm on its own is not good or bad, right?
Yeah.
You need to look at the context. So for example, microservices, right? If you are a startup looking for product market fit, maybe, microservices is not the paradigm you should apply, right? You don't want that complexity. You don't want the benefits of microservices, and the trade-off is very high for you in your context. So that's another disclaimer, right? When you look at a paradigm like data mesh, try to understand the context where you are to see if the paradigm can be applied in that context or not.
I think you can see a lot of conversations on the internet at the moment, either between like monoliths or microservices, or about whether serverless is perfect or whether it's shit. Right? There seems to be a lot of like polarization on Hacker News about these things. I think we would argue that that stems from a lack of appreciation of thinking about what is the trade-off of each paradigm and whether it serves your needs in a particular context. So we aren't the sort of people who are going to be saying we're on this team and not on that team, that the developers who came before us who did it this other way are idiots, and now we've discovered the perfect way and you should switch, right? I mean, that's fun sometimes, to do that in the pub, but that's not the approach of a mature engineer. Cool. Do we have a bit of... Okay. Cool, so do you still have the sound? Okay. So the microservices promise, right? We use microservices as an example there. So the way I would describe the bargain that you are striking when you adopt microservices is that if you break things into small pieces, you can change them independently so long as you don't mind the added integration complexity, right? If you've got lots of microservices, you have to worry about things about errors over the network when they're communicating with each other, about deploying things and maintaining backwards compatibility that you didn't need to think about when you had a monolith. And so I think microservices are great in many contexts, but I don't think that you should go into a microservice architecture without understanding what it is that is going to be the pain point that you're going to have to deal with if you want that wonderful benefit of being able to scale and change things independently.
So let's look now at domain-driven design, right?
Yeah.
So what's the promise? The promise is that if you align the architecture to your business domain, you will be able to represent your business better, therefore reacting faster to changes, right? With the trade-off that comes with the complexity of doing that. So I've been in teams in organizations where they didn't do domain-driven design, right? And basically, to introduce a tiny change, right? A very simple thing. They have to coordinate 3 or 4 teams, change 2 or 3 systems just for that tiny, small change, right? So the promise of this paradigm is like, okay, if you don't mind the trade-off, you will be able to react quickly as your business evolves.
Yeah, I think we've definitely all seen like the disappointment on a business or product person's face when what feels to them should be a small change, and we have to tell them that actually that's going to involve 10 different changes to 10 different systems, a project plan, and lots of people. They're like, but it's a small change, right?
Exactly right.
Well, we would argue that what domain-driven design does is because the structure of the business problem and the technology are aligned, a small change in one should hopefully correspond as often as possible to a small change in the other.
Let's look now into data, right? So let's move into the data world. So let's look into data warehouses, right? As basically an architecture approach. Data warehouses have been with us since, I believe, the 80s, right? Around the 80s and so.
Yeah.
And the promise is that basically you can model your data up front, so that allows you to, query that data, as long as you don't mind the effort of aggregating that data and reconciling it, right? The problem with this paradigm is like, you model the data front, therefore you are modeling the data for the questions you have now, right? Not the questions you are going to have in 5, 6 months, right? And also you don't model all the data, right? Because back then, and even now, right? Sometimes you just model a specific set of data. That constrains the questions you can ask, the questions you can answer with the data, right?
Makes sense. And so I guess like more recently, people have moved to more often adopting data lakes. So what's the data lake paradigm? If we collect raw data in a central location, we can post hoc run queries about it. So like Pablo said, we can ask questions that we didn't know we had later, so long as we don't mind dependencies being implicit, right? And I think this is actually an underappreciated kind of kicker to adopting a data lake. If the way that you collect your data is to kind of put it in a big central location, it disrupts the path of human connection between the people who are using the data and the people who put it there in the first place, right? Maybe it's hard to interpret. Maybe there's subtle cases around like freshness or quality. Maybe there's like changes to the meaning of data or columns that happen over time, and the people who are consuming don't know about it. I guess the classic example is like schema changes. To me, the classic data lake case is someone's putting data in a data lake. At some point, they decide to change their data model. They don't know who's consuming it. They kind of don't care, in a sense, who's consuming it. They don't have responsibility to give a shit about who's consuming it, basically. And so the people who are then building machine learning models, analytics on top of that, just find that when they come in one morning, that something stops working. Stops working best case. I've seen cases working in financial systems where a column containing deposits used to mean how much money was in the account. You could just add it up. But then actually it turned out there was going to be another kind of money transfer, so that there were two things you had to add up. So the data didn't break, but the analytics, basically like the report that said how much money the bank had, went from being correct to incorrect.
Yeah. So
why do we care about data mesh then? Well, if we give responsibility to the data for the people who are producing it, to actually care that they're not breaking things, to care about the people using it, we can more rapidly incorporate new sources of data, but also more rapidly incorporate the consumption of data as well. And then I said there was a trade-off, right? The trade-off is, so long as we don't mind distributing skills throughout the organization and investing in self-service infrastructure. And so, if you're not willing to accept that bit, I would say you're going to have a hard time being successful with data mesh.
Exactly. Cool. So that was the introduction. Let's look now at the principles, right?
Yeah.
So there are 4 main principles, and we are going to go through each of them. But this is kind of the foundation, right? Like these are the principles outlined by Asa Mack in the original book. They complement each other, I will see. You probably need all of them to have a successful data mesh, and therefore, unlocking the value that it promised. But that doesn't mean that you can maybe not take some ideas from each of them, right, and apply it in your current context. So let's look at the first one, right? So the first one is domain ownership, and basically what it is making the people that generate the data own that data, right, and be responsible for that data. And what's the value of this principle? The value of this principle is reducing the hands-off, right, between where the data is originated and where the data is consumed. For example, I've been in projects where I was in a delivery team or a product team where basically we were working with some type of data, and someone said, hey, you need to ship this to the data platform. And we just basically push it through a pipe, AWS Firehouse or so. We forget about it, right? And we didn't know anything about how the data is going to be used, who is using it. And that was,
Are you one of those people who changed the schema and kind of just didn't care, right?
Yeah, we just
you couldn't hear the screams.
We just care about the microservice and how it's going to react to the schema chain, right? But Yeah, so that's the first one. The second one, and this is the one I like the most, and I think for me, in my opinion, is the core of, of this new concept, that is data as a product, right? Thinking on applying product thinking into data. So basically, make the people that generate the data thinking about how that data is going to be used, right? The value here is you go from being reactive to be proactive, right? So the example we just say, right? I was being reactive when someone from the data team told me, hey, look, my report doesn't work anymore because, the schema changed. It's like, what report? Who are you?
Yeah.
That was the situation, right? To be proactive, to say, hey, if we change this schema here, our data product, that is, a finance report, needs to change to, and basically think on the value. And not only that, right? Like any other product, is like you build it in a product fashion, but also you track the usage and you make sure that this is still delivering value, right? And if it's not delivering value, you decommission the data product, for example.
And just a terminology thing, you said data product. So what commonly happens in data mesh is, like you might say, one microservice is kind of the unit of architecture in the microservices world. One data product is like the individual thing. We don't want to say data set, because data set implies it's just like bits on a disk.
Yeah.
We want to include all the love and care that goes into it as well.
Exactly.
Cool. So we talked about the compensation we have to do in data mesh for to get the benefits, and one of them is self-service data platform, right? So if we're telling teams that were already really busy with all the feature backlogs and all the operational concerns they already had, that they've now got to do extra work, which is to care about the data that's coming from their systems, we really need to find a way of reducing the amount of work and worry they have as well. Otherwise, we're going to maybe overwhelm them, or maybe turn them into people who are not advocates for adopting data mesh. So self-service data platform, if anyone's worked with cloud infrastructure, you're used to this shift from I used to have to file a ticket to I now have an API, I can now automatically provision stuff. This is a really important thing that you have to get right so that you can free up time in the teams to care about the data that they produce. Another thing that you need to do, right, is have cooperation that you agree about. I'm mentioning the word governance, and as Stefan said earlier, people really don't like the idea of being governed, right? Governance feels like something that someone else is doing to you that's micromanaging. But the idea of cooperation, I think, is really important in data mesh. And that's because if we go back to like the data warehouse paradigm, the way governance worked is the enterprise data team has all the data, they know where it is, it's in a system they control, and so they can enforce policy, rules, etc. Now we're saying the data lives in lots of different places, and we want people to independently produce data products. We need to have ground rules so that they know what to do, so they can be good citizens of the data mesh. Hopefully that's not architects micromanaging. Hopefully that's something where it can be a participatory process, and the different people who are involved can agree what kind of standards we need for IDs, how do we describe data quality, what discoverability do we use so that we can figure out what is out there. But I think it is really important, even though, the G word is something that maybe developers don't like that much.
Cool. So those are the 4 principles, right? One way we like to think about it is separating it into groups. One affecting the team or the team scope, and the other one affecting the organization. So the team scope will be the domain ownership and the data as product. So basically making the teams, empowering the team and making them autonomous, but also providing some accountability, right? So basically making them accountable. But in order to do this, you need the other 2, right? You need the self-serve data platform and some type of governance. And if it's automated, of course, the better, right? So basically provide some type of tools and some type of guidelines in the form of standards and rules that you basically allow you to scale this data mesh concept and don't end up in data chaos, right? Or in worse state. As we mentioned here, to get the benefit of data mesh, you probably need all of them, but I encourage you to think how you could start applying some of the ideas of each of them, right? Because they are valuable on its own also. Cool. So let's go to the last bit, the practicalities. So how is this working in the real world, right?
Yeah.
So let's start why data mesh is important right now, or why we think it's important right now. The way we see it is like the upsize of this new paradigm are going up, right? So basically, there is a proliferation of data. We all know that.
Yeah.
If you ask any executive of any company, it's like, no, my company needs to be data-driven or is already data-driven. There are a lot of new use cases with machine learning, like ChatGPT and so on. So we think, the upsides are going up. At the same time, the downsides are going down. Like the cost of infrastructure, as you probably know, is being reduced. There is a lot of innovation. There are a lot of offerings in the cloud. You only pay for what you use. They are self-managed and so on. We also see a lot of innovation in the tooling in the data space, right? So basically, the tools are becoming easier to use, therefore allowing more people to interact and get value out of the data. So the data skills required are not so complex as before. And that's why we think this is relevant right now.
Cool. So we wanted to give a couple of real examples of companies that are using data mesh, not tech companies, but companies that rely and get value out of tech, because that's how we convince you that what we're talking about is not just a fancy idea, but something that is practical and something real people are doing to get real work done. So one example is the company Glovo. I guess like people in Spain hopefully know it very well. It's a unicorn delivery startup based in Barcelona. Clearly, when you have these kind of like scale-ups, you rely a lot on good data, both to predict what your customers want and to control your operations. Recently, during COVID, that became especially important for these kind of companies because consumer behaviors could not be easily predicted from what we were used to in the past, so they needed to react and understand very quickly. And as you probably know as well, there's a lot of competitors to companies like Glovo, so it's a space that's quite furious, and they need to make sure they're on top of their game. Go to the next slide. So the two big lessons that we learnt while working on data mesh with Glovo, one is that every system that produces or transforms important data needs to have a clear owner. Right? When you're a scale-up, there's a lot of things to do, there's a lot of priorities, there's a lot of systems being built, people are moving around, we're doing something different than we did before. But you need to make sure that if there's important data, that every step of the chain from its production to it being used is owned by someone, because otherwise what you're going to end up with is maintenance problems, low data quality, things where there's a big problem and there's no clear person who knows how or is going to take responsibility to fix it. And so, Glovo found they needed to make sure they were clear with their staff that this was a priority, that when they were balancing things off, as you do in the startup world when you have a lot to do, making sure that the chain of provenance for data was owned and loved and maintained was something that was key. The second one, though, is more about governance, right? Normal developers dislike governance. People who join scale-ups and startups hate it, right? They came to do something special. They want to change the world. Hope they want to move fast. Hopefully not break too many things, but definitely they want to move fast. But that was kind of one of our lessons, that we really needed to approach governance with a spirit of cooperation and introduce clear rules about what aspects of data quality we needed to measure and communicate. So we didn't want to say, here's this fixed box of exactly what quality data means for every source, because different use cases, different sources, etc. But we did need to agree on a common language of what were the dimensions of data quality we were measuring and how we were going to communicate them. Otherwise, the people who were consuming the data couldn't make intelligent decisions about what they can and should use that data for.
Cool. Let's look at another example, right? This one is a bit bigger, right?
Yeah.
So it's one of the big enterprises out there. And it's Roche, right? So Roche is a company that is one of the biggest healthcare providers in the world. They have over 100,000 employees. They work in many markets. So they are different type of company, right?
Yeah.
And they have a lot of data, as you probably know. Basically, they have many challenges trying to get the value of that data. So they saw in data mesh as a new approach, a new paradigm that could help them untap the power of that data. And they partnered with Thoughtworks to try to help them in that data mesh journey and the data mesh implementation. So the main two challenges in this company was the data interoperability. As you can imagine, a company so big doesn't only rely on one data platform, right? They have many data platforms. Usually those data platforms are designed and built around a project or a use case. And then you end up what's called data silos, right? So you have some data here in this data platform, there is other data here, and you cannot combine it. They are not interoperable, right? So and that creates a lot of pain. The other main challenge was basically constraints in terms of accessing the data. Both like,
especially like healthcare stuff, right?
Exactly.
Like you want to be careful when responsible.
Exactly, you need to be really careful with the data people can access. But not only at the organization level, but also at the technical level, right? So they started their data mesh journey, and basically the main two lessons learned, they are a bit different from the previous one, as you can see, but it's basically start your journey with your current organizational boundaries, right? So data mesh, as you can see, has a lot into it. It's not, the principles are simple maybe to digest, but then when you go and try to implement it, it requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of changes in the organization, right? So what we recommend usually is to start with your current domains, your current organizational boundaries, right? Don't go there and try to tell people, okay, let's start the data mesh implementation, and let's also change the domains and the bounded context, right? So start with your organizational boundaries. When you are more advanced in your journey in data mesh, maybe you want to change domains or rearrange things, right? The other thing is like any, I would say anything in technology, right? Try to implement something and show value early, right? So work in a way that is incremental, and you deliver value in each increment. Involve the business people, right? They need to see the return on investment quickly, right? If not, your data mesh initiative may be shut down, right? And also involve the developer, right? So one of the principles is around the self-service data platform, right? That platform is for the developers and for the people interacting with the data. So involve them early, show the value so they get onboarded into the platform and they start using it.
Absolutely. So if you've heard us talk about data mesh and you think, oh, maybe that could help us out, how should you get started? Right? Because it's a change in responsibility in how people do their work. So it's not something that you could just stop your organization, change it, and then you've got data mesh. So the way we recommend starting is basically to start with some clear win use cases. Like not probably just one, because one thing doesn't really make a mesh, but a collection of related valuable use cases that you know that are going to solve problems the business have. And then you work backwards from those use cases through to the data products you need to supply those use cases. And then I guess you need to think about what you need on the platform level, which is
exactly. Try to identify what's called the thinnest valuable platform, right? It's kind of applying the MVP mentality to your platform capabilities. Try to start building the platform with the minimum you need to support that use case or a couple of use cases you identify. And finally, in terms of governance, I'll let you.
Yeah. Well, again, that's why we're trying to use the word cooperation. So really, you just need to ask, okay, what do we need to agree on to get started, right? And that might be, we need to agree to install this data catalog and do all this other, or it might be, okay, we need to agree to have a README in the repositories we're using to manage the data products that says what's in it, and that's the cooperation we need at this scale, and then we can worry about other heavier weight tools once we've got more scale. We might, in theory, have to worry about how we identify customers, what kind of IDs we use. Maybe we need standards for that. But maybe we don't need them straight away because maybe actually the first couple of data products don't have customer identification, and it would be a waste of time to argue about what we need to agree on with those kinds of data early on. So really just think, okay, we're a team, we're in the same company, we're trying to achieve something together. What do we need to agree on to cooperate so far? And more importantly, we need to set our expectation that we're going to evolve what cooperation is necessary over time, right? We're not going to just define rules, print them in a book, put them on the CTO's desk, and then that's the reference forever. We need a way of periodically refreshing them. We need a way of people who are involved, who are stakeholders of the system, to volunteer suggestions for new kinds of cooperation, changes to existing ones, removal of old rules, so that it makes sure that the governance serves the needs of the people who are in the system rather than kind of something imposed on them.
Cool.
So maybe we can just sum up. So hopefully you now kind of know what data mesh is, right? Like maybe when you came in, you just knew it was as two words. Hopefully now you understand kind of what it is, what it's made of, why you might use it, why it's relevant now, and that if you do want to get started with it, you have an idea about where you would go to start. Thanks very much.
Thank you.